Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the fourth session in the Center for Environmental Health 6-week Maternal and Child Health webinar series. In this series, we are focusing on unconventional natural gas extraction and development, otherwise known as fracking, and exploring the potential health impacts for women of childbearing age, pregnant women, and infants and children. We are pleased to have with us today Dr. David Carpenter. Dr. Carpenter is a public health physician whose current position is Director of the Institute for Health and the Environment at the University of Albany, as well as Professor of Environmental Health and Sciences within the School of Public Health at the University of Albany. After receiving his medical degree from Harvard Medical School, Dr. Carpenter chose a career of research and public health. After research positions at the National Institute of Mental Health and the Armed Forces Radiobiology Research Institute, he came to Albany in 1980 as the director of the Wadsworth Center for Laboratories and Research of the New York State Department of Health, which is the third largest public health laboratory in the United States after NIH and the CDC. In an effort to build ties to an academic program, he initiated efforts to create a partnership between the New York State Department of Health and the University of Albany, resulting in the creation of the School of Public Health in 1985. He was then appointed as the founding dean of the School of Public Health, a position he held until 1998 when he became the director of the Institute of Health and the Environment. Dr. Carpenter has conducted many research studies. The investigations have included health studies and animal toxicology studies, looking at the effects of chemicals on the nervous, immune, and endocrine systems, as well as metabolism. He has also investigated the distribution of various diseases in relation to residents near hazardous waste sites. Dr. Carpenter's research initially was neurobiology and more recently has primarily been the study of human disease resulting from exposure to environmental contaminants. He has more than 300 peer-reviewed publications and has edited 5 books. Today, Dr. Carpenter will focus on environmental exposures that are known to result in reduced cognitive function in children, usually associated with shortened attention span, increased antisocial behavior, and poorer performance in school. This includes a variety of exposures. With regard to chemicals from fracking sites, there is a long history of neurological problems secondary to exposure to volatile organic compounds and reports of similar symptoms of individuals living near to fracking sites. So Dr. Carpenter, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll now turn this over to you so that you can begin your presentation.
Thank you, Ellen. It's a pleasure to talk about the uh, health effects of exposure to children uh, and the effects that they have on IQ and cognitive function. What I propose to do is sort of give a historic perspective on the issue, starting with exposure to lead. And then at the end, I will say something about the issue of fracking and exposures there. So this first slide comes from a 1982 paper, but really from results from a 1979 study by Herb Needleman and his colleagues, where they looked at young children in Boston and analyzed lead in baby teeth. What they found is that for those children that were exposed to high lead, which is shown in the curve on the left, that while there was a range of different IQs, they were all lower than children that were not so highly exposed. And several things to note here is that the IQ differential is maybe about 5 to 7 IQ points. There are some lead-exposed children that are brighter than others, but they're never as bright as the children that were not exposed to lead. Now, in the same study, they looked at behavioral factors. And these are plots now based on 7 different levels, 6 different levels of lead in the teeth, of the baby teeth. And look at, for example, distractibility. What they found is an absolutely linear relationship. The higher the lead in the teeth, the more distractible the child was, the
Uh,
less persistent the child was, the
Dr.
more
Carpenter, sorry to
yes,
interrupt you there. For some reason, some folks are having some trouble seeing your slides. So I'm wondering, at the top of the go-to control panel, there should be an option to show your screen. Do you see that?
show control panel.
Yes, that's right.
All right. Does that improve anything?
I do not believe so. Let's try this again. There we go. Now you're all set. So go ahead. Sorry about that.
Okay. Um, okay, so what I was showing are these changes in behavior as a function of the lead level in teeth. And if you look across here, the higher the lead, the more distractible, the less persistent, the more dependent, the less organized, the more hyperactive, the more impulsive, the more easily frustrated, the more the child was a daydreamer, and the less they were able to follow simple directions. So lead has effects not just on intelligence, but on behavior. Now, further later studies have gone on to look at these associations, and what you find is that the higher the lead level, the more likely the child was not going to complete high school. The higher the lead level, the less they were able to function as adults. And so therefore, this is a long-term disability. Other studies, these observations have been confirmed in any number of studies from around the world. There were sleep problems, there were somatic problems, but notice this, the higher the lead level, the more aggressive the child, the more destructive. And what we have learned over time is basically that there's no concentration of lead that's without hazardous effects. Now, in 1991, the Centers for Disease Control set a level of 10 micrograms per deciliter of lead in blood that they implied was the boundary between safe and unsafe. Well, we now know that that's not true, that in fact, there are even greater decrements in lead function below 10 micrograms per deciliter than above. Look at the lower plot in this figure from a 2005 paper by Lanphier et al., where they pooled results from studies of lead around the world. And when you look at the pooled results, there's a steeper decline between 0 and 10 micrograms per deciliter of lead than there is at higher concentrations. So the reason this hasn't been seen until relatively recently is probably that everybody was in the range of about 10 micrograms per deciliter until we took lead out of gasoline, lead out of paint, and certainly the lead levels in the general population have declined dramatically since that time, but there is no concentration of lead that's without hazard. Now, in terms of behavior, again, going back to the original Needleman study, look at the characteristics of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Hyperactivity, impulsivity, distractibility, difficulty following instructions, conduct problems, reduced executive function, reduced attention, reduced social skills. These are all very similar to those that Needleman showed in 1979. And learning disabilities, kids are categorized as having learning disabilities because their reading and math and spelling are not very good. And also other factors like aggression and antisocial behavior, all related to an environmental exposure. Now, this is ADHD in US children, dated from the NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Study, as a function of lead concentrations, showing clearly that there is greater there's greater diagnosis of children with ADHD if they have elevated lead. Now, the next slide is from my colleague Rick Nevin, who has done some interesting work looking at rates of incarceration in relation to both IQ and lead levels. And what you see is that individuals that are incarcerated tend to have lower IQ. Now, some people may say this is simply because they're less able to avoid being caught, but it is consistent with what is usually seen. Now, what Rick Nevin did, which is really very interesting, is that he looked at the rates of violent crime as a function of lead concentrations or lead emissions from gasoline and paint. And then he offset those curves by 20 years. So the black curve here is the amount of lead that was in gasoline. And that was reduced dramatically about 1990 when this CDC report came out. And it's gone way down since then. The red curve is the rates of violent crime in our society. But this is offset by about 20 years. So the hypothesis is that violent crime is characteristic of 20-year-olds, or usually young males when the testosterone starts to flow. But Rick's hypothesis is that their early life, prenatal or an early life exposure to lead made them much more likely to commit violent crimes when they were late teens, early 20s. And those curves really superimpose very nicely. Now, it's very clear that in this country and most of the developed world, that the rates of violent crime have gone down dramatically. Now, the politicians take credit, the police take credit, but it may well be that the majority of the credit goes to the public health community. And it was a matter of getting lead out of the bodies of people through taking lead out of gasoline, taking lead out of paint, protecting the air because lead is one of the priority pollutants in air. And clearly we haven't taken all lead out. The lower plot here simply looks at the peak age of which people were incarcerated, and it shows that there has been a shift to older ages over time, which is again consistent with this possibility. Now, the issue is, however, that lead is by no means the only chemical that causes reductions in IQ. This next slide shows serum cotinine. Cotinine is a metabolite of nicotine and is what can be easily monitored in either the blood or the urine for passive tobacco smoke, or actually for active tobacco smoke as well. But this is looking at reading scores of children on the basis of their blood level of cotinine, reflecting their exposure to environmental tobacco smoke. What you see is exactly the same pattern that I showed you for lead. There is a decline in reading ability the higher the exposure of the child to environmental tobacco smoke. But it is steepest at very low concentrations and then continues, but not at the same slope with greater levels of exposure. So it isn't just lead, it's also tobacco smoke. And this looks at ADHD in relation to environmental tobacco smoke. It looks very similar to the slide I showed on lead exposure in environmental tobacco smoke. Well, I think the punchline of this story, if I can say that right now, is that so many environmental exposures that we have looked at have this effect of reducing IQ in children. And let me just go through several of them. This is a wonderful study by Elizabeth Gillette, who is really a social anthropologist. And she looked at a native group in Mexico, Yaqui children, and she compared children that live in the valley where there was intense agriculture to children that lived in the foothills where they were removed from the agriculture, but they were the same ethnic group. And she looked at the ability of 4-year-old kids to draw and to do such simple things as catching a ball. What this shows the typical drawings of the 4-year-old kids that lived in the foothills. So they were not around the agricultural fields that had many different pesticides applied. These are the drawings of the kids that lived in the valley, where they were highly exposed and to many, many different pesticides. And you see their ability to draw a human figure is very, very grossly distorted. So this has affected their intelligence. Now, a lot of my work has been with PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. And I want to show a number of slides on that. This is the structure of PCBs. Now, they're very, very different from lead. These are organic compounds. It's 2 benzene rings coupled together, so it's a biphenyl. And there are 10 different sites around these 2 rings which may or may not have chlorines. They either have hydrogen ions or they have chlorines. And that's why they're called polychlorinated biphenyls. Well, they're very useful compounds, or they were very useful. They were used as in capacitors for electrical insulation. They were used as hydraulic fluids. They were added to paints, to window caulking, a variety of things. But then in the late 1970s, they were found to be very persistent, just like lead is persistent. And they were found to be in the bodies of animals and people. And while at that time there wasn't a lot of information of what they did, we all have them in our bodies today, and we know a lot more about how bad they are. The characteristics of PCBs, they're heavy oils. They're not very flammable, so they were good insulators. They're very stable in the environment and in the human body. In the environment, they can exist for decades. In the human body, if you ate a contaminated fish with PCBs last night for dinner, you're likely to have half of those PCBs in your bodies 10 years from now. It takes that long for the body to degrade them and get rid of them. They're present in the food supply in animal fats. So you get them in butter, you get them in whole milk, you get them in eggs, you get them in meat. They are widely distributed. Now, some of them are more volatile and more water soluble than others, but in general, they are fat soluble and accumulate through the food supply. What are the effects of PCB exposure? And this is a slide from Deborah Rice, who's done a lot of work. And look at this. It's almost exactly the same as what I showed you with lead. PCBs reduce IQ in children when they're exposed before birth and in early life. They increase impulsive behavior. They cause attentional problems. You get poor school performance, poor language. You get deviant social behavior, which is to say ADHD, aggression type behavior. But they do something in addition to the effects on the brain, and they blur gender-specific behavior. And I'll talk about that in a little more in detail. Now, these are plots of IQ scores in children in Taiwan that were born to mothers who did or did not eat PCB-contaminated cooking oil. What happened in Taiwan, and a similar thing had happened earlier in Japan, is that there was a machine to make a rice oil, and it used PCBs as a hydraulic fluid. Well, in both situations, the PCBs leaked into the cooking oil, and people were using it for cooking. And nobody noticed any particular problem for a long period of time. And then the problem became the babies that were born to the mothers that were exposed. So if you recall the slide I showed you on lead, the open circles are the children that were exposed to the cooking oil. The open circles are the children not exposed. And these are plots at 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, and 7 years of age. as with lead exposure, those children exposed before birth and via breastfeeding to PCBs have a lower IQ. And this is true over the full range of the distribution of IQ. And several important points here. First one, it doesn't go away. If anything, the children at 7 years of age are more impacted than they were at 4 years of age. But also, like lead, some kids that were exposed to PCBs have a pretty high IQ. But on average, they're not nearly as high as the children that were not exposed to PCBs. Now, we've had a number of studies here in the US looking at PCB exposure and IQ of children. This is a study of children born to mothers that ate a lot of fish out of the Great Lakes. Our Great Lakes fish are highly contaminated with PCBs. This study by Jacobson and Jacobson showed that the children, when tested at 11 years of age, had poorer memory. The most highly exposed children had a 6.2 IQ point deficit. They were 1 year behind in reading, and they were at the lower end of what would be called a normal range of intelligence. Studies in the Netherlands have looked at mothers' PCB concentrations in relation to the cognitive score of the children. And what you see, again, the higher the PCBs in the mother, the poorer the child's cognitive performance. So, as with lead, early life or even prenatal exposure appears to cause reduction in IQ, and it doesn't go away over time. It appears to be an irreversible loss of IQ. Now, the children in the Dutch studies, they showed deficits in verbal comprehension, slower reaction times, more aggression, and then some additional things that lead doesn't do. PCBs interfere with thyroid hormone function. Now, this may be important in relation to the cognitive function, because if your thyroid doesn't work right, if you're born without thyroid function, you become a cretin. So development of the nervous system is critically dependent on activity of the thyroid system. But also PCBs suppress the immune system. And that makes children exposed to PCBs more vulnerable to infection. They have more ear infections. They have more respiratory infections. And in addition, they don't respond as well as non-exposed children to immunization. Very important. And I told you I would come around to this, these gender-specific behaviors. Unlike lead, PCBs are endocrine disruptive chemicals. And in general, they act like estrogen, the female sex hormones. But there are actually 209 different individual PCBs. Some of them are estrogenic, some of them are not. And what was found in these studies is that prenatal PCB exposure was associated with more feminized play behavior in boys. The boys preferred to play with dolls rather than guns. But more masculinized behavior in the girls. And various developmental disorders of the reproductive tract and such things, probably as sexual preference, can be influenced by these early life exposures to chemicals that interfere with the normal sex hormones. This is a study that was done in New York looking at children born to mothers that ate PCB-contaminated Lake Ontario fish. And even at the ripe old age of 48 hours, they were able to demonstrate that infants showed abnormal reflexes and delayed habituation to repetitive stimuli if they were exposed to PCBs. And then when tested at 1 year of age, just like the studies that I showed you from the Netherlands, the higher the PCB in the cord blood now, so monitoring the cord blood, which would be the blood the fetus would be exposed to before birth, the higher the PCBs in the cord blood, the poorer the child performed on a Fagan test of infant intelligence. Now, I've been involved for a number of years with studies on the Native American population in northern New York State. And just to show you some of the results from studies that my colleagues in that research project did, we looked at PCB concentrations in adolescents, children ages 10 to 16, in relation to their performance on cognitive tests. And we categorize PCBs in different ways, but the important point is look at these 4 different kinds of tests. Anytime there's a negative sign in front of the numbers, that means that the higher the PCB level, the poorer the child performed on those tests. And consistently, higher the PCB level, the poorer the child performed. Now, on these tests, none of these children were out of what one would identify as being the normal range. It's just that if your PCB levels were higher, you were not as good as the child that had lower PCB levels. I said earlier, all of us have these chemicals in our body. And so what one can do is say, you know, if I'm not as bright as my neighbor, it's because of my mother and what she ate before I was born. Well, what about adults? And this is interesting too, because most of the work on cognitive development has been focused on children. And that's very important because there's a lot of evidence that some of these effects, maybe all of them, are not reversible. But there is evidence from adults that lead exposure still does reduce memory function in adults. And we looked at 350 adult Mohawks in relation to their blood levels of PCBs and gave them memory tests. And this is what we find. The higher the PCB level, the poorer they performed on the memory test. Now, there's a lot of scatter because obviously not everybody is the same genetically, and there are a variety of other exposures that are important. But it did appear that there was perhaps a threshold concentration above which there was decrements in performance. This is a study from Deborah Rice where she studied monkeys and exposed monkeys to PCBs and then gave them a test where they had to learn a spatial alternation task. The control animals learned in about 15 sessions. The PCB-exposed animals, there was a range of time, but hardly any of them learned as quickly as the animals not exposed to PCBs. This is a fun experiment, again done with colleagues John Lombardo and David Berger. They're in the psychology department at SUNY Cortland, and they developed a rat test that was focused on trying to get at something like ADHD. And so these were rats, male and female rats, that were either fed PCB-contaminated fish coming from the St. Lawrence River where the Mohawks were exposed, or fed a control diet. And so well, first of all, the test was the rats had to earn their water by pressing a bar. But after the light came on indicating they could press the bar, the reward didn't occur for a full 2 minutes. And so what the control animals, both male and female, did is that they started pressing the bar, and they pressed a little more frequently as it got closer to 2 minutes. But the animals that were exposed to PCBs through eating the contaminated food, they started out more rapidly and they pressed much more frequently. So they were impatient. They wanted to be fed. And this was really interesting because this is male control, male fish fed, female control, female fish fed. The animals fed the contaminated food, they would go just bang on the bar multiple times as if to say, damn it, give me the water. And that is so typical of what you see in the human diseases of ADHD, that there is an inability to deal with frustration. So as with exposure to lead, I suspect that we're going to, when we do the studies, find that violent behavior and crime are increased by exposure to these chemicals that not only reduce IQ, but also reduce ability to deal with frustration. Life is full of frustrations for all of us. Some of us deal with it better than others. Well, so we've talked about lead, we've talked about environmental tobacco smoke, we've talked about PCBs. Here's data from mercury. This is from Philip Grandjean's group. And this is prenatal methylmercury exposure studied in children in the Faroe Islands. Methylmercury, unlike inorganic mercury, crosses the brain and it interferes with motor function, with attention, with visual spatial, language and memory. And you see the same pattern we've seen with all of these others. The higher the exposure, the poorer the child did at 7 years of age. Now, methylmercury is a big problem in this country. The Institute of Medicine found that fully 10% of women of reproductive age have a higher level of methylmercury in their body than it's considered safe. And furthermore, if you ate fish for dinner last night, 50% of women had elevated methylmercury exposure. Methylmercury exposure occurs almost only from eating fish because inorganic mercury deposits in bodies of water and microorganisms in the bodies of water cause it to methylate, it becomes fat soluble, and then binds to muscle in the fish. So groups that eat a lot of fish, such as subsistence fisher persons, Native Americans, are at particular risk. Now, the risk expands to others as well. What's the all-American sandwich for kids? Probably tuna salad. Well, tuna salad contains significant amounts of methylmercury, especially if it's white or albacore tuna. And that is not something you want to give your child if you expect him to learn at school. All right, so from all of these things, this is a wonderful slide, again from Needleman. What we see in the population is that there is a distribution of IQ. And, you know, the average IQ is usually taken to be at about 100. And some people are on the lower end, some people are at the higher end. Those people at the tail end of the lower end are either called mentally retarded, although that's not a socially acceptable term any longer, but they're intellectually challenged. Whereas those people at the upper end are the gifted. These are the geniuses. Well, what happens if your child is exposed to lead or PCBs or ETS or methylmercury, and the curve shifts down by 5 IQ points? Well, the person at this point on the curve probably isn't that severely impacted because they probably still hold a job. They graduate from high school, maybe even from college. But look at what happened to the number of gifted people, just dramatically reduced. And look at what happened to the number of intellectually challenged people that probably can't hold a job, that are dependent on society. So this is a very important issue. And one of the things that I find that's a major lack in our understanding is that most of the studies that have been done have looked at one chemical at a time, either at lead or at PCBs or at methylmercury. And the question that is not answered is what happens if a child is exposed to all of these things. Do they have additive effects? Less than additive? I've written some wonderful grants, but they never got funded to try to answer those questions. All right. Ellen wanted me to at least go back and talk a little bit about fracking because that's obviously an enormous challenge right now. And I also have been involved to some degree with the issues around fracking. The gases that are released from fracking, and I'll talk mainly about the gases rather than the water contamination, but you have a lot of volatile organic chemicals. You have formaldehyde, and the formaldehyde is actually formed from the action of sunlight on these volatile organic chemicals. It's very similar to the way ozone is formed. You have hydrogen sulfide, and I've been getting much more informed about hydrogen sulfide. Some natural gas is actually up to 90% hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is released from volcanoes. It's formed in the earth, and it's a very dangerous gas. Natural gas contains radon, and the backflow water contains radium, which is both are radioactive elements. Radon, with a half-life of less than 4 days, is inhaled and it's the second leading cause of lung cancer. And all of these things, the volatile organics, formaldehyde, hydrogen sulfide, radon, all of them have adverse health effects. Now, the question is, do they affect intellectual development? Well, we know that particulates and volatile organics cause respiratory disease, increase the risk of asthma, respiratory infections, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. They also have effects on memory and fatigue, and they cause nosebleeds. Now, the nosebleeds is an interesting one, which I suspect is a combination of the formaldehyde, which is basically embalming fluid that pickles the mucous membranes of the nose, and then you inhale the hydrogen sulfide, which makes acid and degrades the tissue. Workers at these fracking sites are injecting sand. You get powdered silica, which causes respiratory disease. And in some of these volatile organics are endocrine disruptors, just like the PCBs that I talked about. Others cause liver and kidney damage. So a host of diseases that can result from these exposures. Now, we don't have a lot of information about cognitive function of people living around fracking wells. We have a lot of information about occupational exposure to volatile organic chemicals. And this is, I think, where we need to have studies, especially of children, but also of adults around fracking wells. There's the syndrome called the organic affective syndrome, which is depression and irritability from repeated breathing in of volatile organics. It goes on at a little more intense exposure to chronic encephalopathy, where you get fatigue, disturbances in memory and attention, very much like those we've talked about with lead and PCBs and methyl mercury. And finally, at very high levels, there is loss of intellectual abilities, impaired judgments, and effects on memory and personality. Ozone, again, formed by the interaction of sunlight on the volatile organic chemicals. It causes formation of smog. It increases the risk of respiratory disease. And it's interesting to note that the ozone levels in the fracking states in the West are even worse than they are in Los Angeles. Very concerning. Particulate matter, the particulate matter is not coming from the natural gas itself, but it's from all the diesel machinery that's associated with fracking and transport of the gas and the flowback water. Exposure during the first year of pregnancy is associated with respiratory disease, possibly with elevations in rates of autism. Certainly, in adults, clear evidence that elevations in particulate matter increases the risk of cardiovascular and respiratory disease and of dying on days with elevated levels. This is a report of self-reported data from Pennsylvania, people living around fracking wells. And what you see is all of these things, from irritation, fatigue, sinus problems, nasal irritations, burning of the eyes, shortness of breath, joint pain, headaches, feeling weak and tired, sleep disturbances, forgetfulness, lumbar pain, muscle aches and pains, difficulty breathing, and so forth. And they're more severe, more often reported in people living closer to the wells than people living further away. So just to conclude, there are a number of environmental contaminants that cause a similar profile to reduced cognitive function. And these appear all to be accompanied by adverse behavioral effects. And let me just say here that one of the big questions to my mind, I for many years studied animal models of cognitive function, but I never could find out how to look in the brain of animals to go from, we know areas that are related to IQ, but how these relate to things like attention span and ability to deal with frustration. Those are major questions that are still we don't just have adequate information. But clearly, in humans, there is an association between substances that reduce IQ and substances that cause shortened attention span and reduced ability to deal with frustration. The volatile organics near fracking wells certainly alter the immune system, and we do know that children are more vulnerable, but basically anything that affects a child also affects adults. So we've got to find ways of reducing the exposure to all of us to these environmental agents that have dramatic effects on our brain. And I'll stop there and see if there are questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. Thank you very much. That was really a fabulous, fabulous presentation, really a great overview of what we can try to understand from the current research studies available, looking at environmental exposures and how these environmental impacts affect cognition, development, and behavior, and then how you tied it in with potential exposures to fracking. I think that was really, really, really excellent. So at this point, we'll now turn it over to questions from the attendees. And attendees, please go ahead and start to type in your questions in the Go to Control panel, and we'll begin to answer those. So Dr. Carpenter, we have our first question here, which is, are there, to your knowledge, any studies that are planned assessing cognition in children and how it relates to potential exposures from fracking?
I'm not aware of any. It's been interesting because in the U.S. Congress has exempted the oil and gas industry from most regulation. The federal agencies have been relatively resistant and reluctant to fund studies specifically focused on fracking. I think that's changing. At least the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences is now beginning to support studies on human populations and exposure to fracking sites. I'm not aware, I know that there's nothing that's been published that is other than some of these community surveys. And those community surveys are very important. And they suggest serious and significant health effects. But usually they're not funded at a level that allows one to really do the study as well as would be ideal. So I'm not aware of any studies ongoing that are funded by the federal government, but it's desperately needed.
Okay, great. So we have another question here where the attendee asks, if we were to compare EDCs to lead, which finally had significant mitigation in the 1970s, in what decade are we with this research? Are we in the 1940s, earlier, or later?
Well, we're a long way from understanding all of the effects of the endocrine disruptive chemicals. What we're finding is they have so many effects, and I'm actually I think some of the effects are perhaps not even mediated by endocrine systems. I mean, they affect the heart. They affect rates of blood pressure. I've done a lot of work on hypertension in relation to PCB exposure, and that's not really an endocrine effect. So we're at a very primitive stage. We're perhaps at the 1990 stage with lead, or 1991 stage with lead, where the warnings have been issued, but we don't really know the magnitude of the risks. And particularly with relation to exposures to mixtures of chemicals that may be even very different chemicals, but all have the same kinds of outcome.
Great. And we have another question here, which is, what was the specific Pennsylvania community in which the childhood health effects were documented? I believe you showed these in the second to last slide.
Well, I should have gotten that reference, and I took that slide out of a presentation. And I just can't answer that question, but I can research that and let the person that asked that question know. It's a wonderful brochure with a number of, I think, gas something or other, but I don't have the reference in front of me.
Okay, so for that attendee, Jennifer will try to get you that reference and get that information to you. We have another question here regarding, again, one of the slides. There's a question about where was the slide on symptoms relative to distance from wells from?
Repeat that, please.
Yes, the question is, where was the slide on symptoms relative to distance from the wells from? There was a slide, I think you were talking about symptoms relative to the distance.
Yes, that's the same slide that was related
okay.
to the last question.
Okay.
From that Pennsylvania study, and again, I'll have to get that reference.
Okay, so we'll get back to you as well on that one as well.
Yes.
Then we have another question about studies concerning future studies planned, and the question is, if studies were planned looking at potential fracking exposures from being near fracking wells and children and neurodevelopment, would there be particular chemicals that you would actually recommend to be studied in particular as those chemicals relate to fracking?
Well, that's a good question and a difficult one to answer because, first of all, there's so many chemicals we don't even know all of the ones that are used at fracking sites. I think that the focus that I would want to take would be on the air concentrations, probably of the volatile organics. Now, is it apparent from the earlier data I presented, most of the studies that have been done on IQ and behavior are studies of early life exposure. Now, we don't really have much of that for fracking because it's a relatively new phenomenon. We have the possibility of getting information about acute exposure to people of various ages. But the question is, I think, a realistic way to study things at this stage would be looking at the incidence of headaches, of sense of mental fatigue, of physical fatigue. The longer-term studies of cognitive development in children that live for many, many years around fracking wells as compared to the children that don't, that's going to take a long time to do. And I'm not arguing that we should wait for those studies, although they're clearly going to be important in the long term.
Great. We have another question here. Even though PCBs have been banned, as you said, they are still found in the environment. What is the best way to avoid exposure to them? For example, I believe there are certain fish types that don't have high PCB levels, like wild salmon. So is that fish might be safer? Is this true? And are there other routes of exposure that can be avoided?
Well, that's a good question, and again, a complicated one to answer. I was involved in studies of contaminants in salmon, and it's true that the farm salmon had much higher concentrations of PCBs and a whole variety of other fat-soluble chlorinated pesticides than the wild salmon. But it's interesting that salmon don't have high levels of mercury. So people that focus only on mercury say eat a lot of salmon because they have low mercury. I say don't eat a lot of salmon because they have high PCBs and pesticides. The general advice is that fish that are raised in contaminated environments are going to be contaminated. Uh, Vegetarian fish are much healthier than carnivorous fish. Small fish are less likely to be contaminated than big fish because they haven't lived as long and haven't accumulated so much. Uh, you know, fish is a very healthy food if it's not contaminated, but if it's contaminated, it can be very dangerous. Uh, the reality is, however, that many of us eat more meat and chicken and hamburgers than we do fish, and the same chemicals are in all of the other products as well, albeit at lower concentration. But it's a matter of how much of any one source you eat in relation to its concentration. And if you eat more hamburger than you eat fish, but there's a tenth of the concentration in the hamburger that there's in the fish, and you eat 10 times more hamburger, why obviously your exposure is going to be the same. So just being cognizant, avoid animal fat to the degree possible, and know where the contaminants are if you can get that information.
So we have one more question here, which is, should we be more concerned about cumulative exposures and rethinking the toxicological approach, especially for early development? Where is the science on this?
Well, the science has grown enormously, and I totally agree with the sentiment behind that question, that we really should be concerned about early development. And there's so many chemicals that are now being found to increase uh, uh, effects on cognitive development, effects on reproductive function, uh, effects just on physical function. And it's chemicals that are present everywhere. Our whole society has become chemical dependent. It's the chemicals in plastics. It's the chemicals that get into the food, they get into the water and the air, and adversely impact the development of the human infant. Uh, these same chemicals don't have beneficial effects on adults either. But children are really our future. They're the next generation, and we should do everything we can to protect them from exposure to chemicals that are going to cause harm.
Great. And Dr. Carpenter, actually, a couple additional questions just came in. So do you mind if we answer those as well?
Not at all.
Okay, great. So we have another question here, which is, are you aware of similar studies that also control for socioeconomic factors? For example, people with lower socioeconomic status may live closer to contaminated sites, have different diets, different education levels, health behaviors, and so forth that can impact contaminant exposure. In essence, controlling for this could help to ensure that environmental exposure to chemicals is indeed the cause of observed effects rather than a symptom of effects that might be caused by other factors.
Well, again, it's an excellent question. And most of the studies that I've recounted have attempted to control for socioeconomic factors. It's clear that poverty is the biggest risk factor for poor health, and for a variety of reasons. That poor people usually have less options to eat healthier food. They live in more dangerous surroundings, both at home and their home may be located near to waste sites and that sort of thing. And I think all of us struggle to adequately control for socioeconomic status. Now, most of the studies that I've recounted, for example, our studies with Mohawks, this is a rather homogeneous population without a great variation in socioeconomic status. And we find there that we're quite confident it's the exposure level that's important. The original Needleman studies were done in relatively poor areas of Boston, and insofar as it was possible, they matched the control children to the exposed children. Uh, but it's a good question, and there's rarely a totally adequate control for socioeconomic status for all of these reasons that low income increases the risk of exposure.
And our last question is, do you think children who live by airports or freeways may be exposed to similar environmental contaminants?
Short answer is yes, no question. Uh, we have, for example, published a report that shows that children living in the same zip code as a fuel-fired power plant, which emits the same things as traffic, but it doesn't move around. But those children have more respiratory infections, they have more asthma. In our study, we didn't look at individual children, we looked at hospitalization rates, so we can't comment about cognitive function. But living near a thruway increases your exposure to all of the air pollutants, many of which are common to fracking sites. And one would expect the same kinds of diseases to be more common than unexposed children.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Carpenter, so much for your time today and a fabulous presentation. And thank you for those who submitted questions. We had some really great questions today. If you do have questions for Dr. Carpenter, please feel free to send those to myself or directly to Dr. Carpenter, and we'll be sure that we have your questions answered. So we will now take a minute and we will be wrapping up the presentation today. We just want everyone to remember that we still have two more sessions. Session 5 next week, we will have Dr. Sheila Bushkin. Dr. Sheila Bushkin will be talking about environmental toxins and their link to metabolic disorders and chronic diseases. So we will be sending out the GoToWebinar information for that session over the next few days, as well as a survey um, and some additional information. So please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, and please um, keep that on your radar for next week. And also, many of you inquired about the status of recordings for the sessions that have already happened. So we noticed a glitch in one of the recordings, and so we're in the process of putting up those recordings shortly. So those should be available. The slides for the first couple of presenters are already up on the webinar webpage, so you can go to those, and we'll be sure to be putting up and posting Dr. Carpenter's slides from today as well. So again, feel free to reach out to me, and thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great day. Take care.